Hello, everybody. Paul Marco here. Delighted to have you join us this morning. I wanted to just let you know that we'll be waiting for just a few more minutes while we have others join. So stand by. We'll be in it with you in about a minute. Thank you. Hit. Hello, everybody. Welcome again. We have a bunch of people still coming in. We're going to give it another 30 seconds or so while people are still joining. And maybe Zamir is giving me the thumbs up. So we're just going to get going. So thank you so much for attending. Welcome wherever you are in the world. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you. Again, the Luminarian Fellowship is delighted to be sponsoring this event. This is our second webinar of what we will be planning as many. We hope that you can continue to join us. The first, we had a fireside chat about a couple of weeks ago with Professor Michael Lepek at Stanford University and Jeff Wong, who's an advisor to the Luminarian Fellowship and former Chief Global Innovation Officer at EY. If you haven't taken a look at that, I highly recommend that you take a peek. They covered a number of different subjects around this fireside chat. And one of the responses we had from many of our guests was, well, that's great conversation. How can we get into a little bit more detail, understanding what the innovation system is all about? I can tell you from my background at Stanford University, having driven a unit that was innovating around education technology, we saw three different dimensions innovation in the workforce. And I'd like you to maybe think about this in your own organizations and corporations. The first was incremental innovation, people who are working to really improve the experience for a customer. And that didn't have to be inventing sort of the next AI system, but rather thinking about how do you improve services and operations that are very close to home so that you can reduce friction for customers. The second space is really evolutionary innovation. With the advent of AI, many of us have a chance to improve the products and services that we create. So thinking about sort of human plus AI in your organization, how can you operationalize that? And indeed, as we're crafting the Luminarian Fellowship, and we can share a little bit more later, we're thinking about how do we enable key drivers in organizations to understand the potential impact of innovation and the ways in which that might drive evolutionary innovation in your organization. And then finally, disruptive organization. This is the land of the Elon Musks, who are really driving a significant change in the automotive industry. Whether you love him or you hate him, one of the things that Elon Musk and his company Tesla has done is really start to change the landscape. They addressed the customer experience by going direct to sales approach. They created a new and fairly effective platform. Previous to Tesla, most of the electric cars were rather on the sort of homely side. And then finally, they thought about the system, the charging system, and the ways in which this platform, the vehicle, could extend its drive and experience. So really, that's the sort of, again, three phases of innovation: the incremental phase, the evolutionary phase, and then the disruptive or revolutionary phase, as we've seen. All of these things provide some framing for our host and wonderful guest, Pedram Mokrian, who will be driving this presentation. I want you to think about three things as before I introduce Pedram. So what's happening in the context of innovation in your organization or what you see in the world? We'd love to get some questions at the end and spark some discussion. The second is, what are you liking about what you see in the innovation space in your organization or elsewhere? Thinking more broadly about what's happening that's positive. And then what do you wish for a little different, especially in organizations that are need more than ever innovation, but rather struggle to execute some of these things? So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Pedram Mokrian. Pedram is an adjunct faculty member at Stanford University, where he's been teaching for many, many years. In fact, he and I met in 2014, a decade ago, when we were creating programs for industry. It was a delightful experience, and every time we needed somebody to give us perspective on the markets around innovation and entrepreneurship, we brought Pedram in, and he became part of the Stanford landscape. So he spends lots of time there, including now teaching. In his spare time, he's the CEO of Innovera, a company that's focused on helping corporations drive innovation. We'll be sharing just a little bit about that and also the Luminarian Fellowship in a short while. So Pedram, without further ado, I turn it to you to share some insights around innovation, broadly writ, and take it away.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Paul, and delighted to have everybody join us today. I have a tendency of sometimes going rogue when it comes to format, content, and what have you. And one of the things that I will say I went rogue on was actually the title of the session. And so without further ado, I'm going to jump right into it. We had a conversation as a team earlier about what the topic should be, and obviously we know it's going to be innovation. And I just had this lurking title in the back of my mind, which was like, innovation is dead. And I want you to think about that for a second. Innovation is dead. And the reason I wanted to start off with this is because I think it's somewhat provocative. And it gets people thinking a little bit, and they're like, oh my God, what's this guy talking about? This doesn't make any sense. The reality is, innovation as you currently define it is dead. And that's the topic I want to talk to you a little bit about. I've been teaching innovation, as Paul mentioned, for over a decade, largely stemming from my background in venture capital and thinking about how do venture-backed companies actually grow and how do we take the venture model abroad. And a lot of what I'm going to share with you are literally from my previous slides of me teaching this topic. And the first one I want to begin with is just the definition of this thing. So as defined, traditionally or historically, or even today, innovation is a process of transforming ideas into new products, new services, new businesses, and even new processes. And at the end of the day, the objective is to create value. And the one main thing that we were battling with before was just defining the difference between innovation and ideation, or innovation and just creativity. So it's much more than that. It's about implementation, adoption, and impact. Why do I have a lollipop on the right-hand side? It's because if you look at this definition, there is no urgency. This is a nice to have, right? And it kind of has been for a long time. It really has been treated as a nice to have. It's great. So if it works, it works. And if it doesn't work, well, we didn't transform our ideas. So we just go back to the drawing board, and no harm, no foul. You're kind of describing this thing that is pretty and it's nice and what have you. And one of the things that I think we were struggling with, even describing what's going on here, is the fact that this definition starts to fall short. So why is that? Well, if we just look at the corporate landscape over the past few years alone, we're more or less at a rate of about $1.5 trillion invested each year by corporations on innovation. So that includes R&D, that includes CVC, that does not include new product development functions or corporate development functions or what have you, right? This is largely R&D and just corporate venturing. That is an enormous amount of money, an enormous amount of money. So clearly people are invested in this, right? And vested in this. But here's a challenge, right? So if you look at statistically what's going on with that money, 80% of companies don't achieve their innovation goals. That's not to say that the projects aren't working. It just means that they're not even objectively hitting their goals that they thought about. So, how do we increase that likelihood? 3 out of 5 companies don't know how to measure this, right? So how do we think about quantifying this and creating a system of record that allows us to do this? And the one that is very maybe controversial and debatable and who knows is the relationship between R&D and financial success for companies. Um, and to me, it's less of that as being the issue. I think it's more about the issue of let's not talk about the volume of investment, but let's talk about how that capital is actually being invested and how those resources are being allocated. And so as a result, we think about this $1.5 trillion, and then we think about, well, it's largely ineffective. So why is that? Well, in many cases, as I mentioned before, we've been kind of stuck in this ideation trap, where the conversations around design thinking and what have you are brilliant, are fantastic. They are tools, but they don't take us all the way across the structures and the machinery of how to think about an organization that generates outcomes from those ideas. And so the fast, fun part is the ideation part. The hard and largely much more expensive part is the value realization implementation part of things. And as we think about even classical definitions of innovation, we need both of these things to come hand in hand, right? So we need crazy ideas, interesting ideas, a lot of iteration, a lot of tools that allow us to be more customer centric, to think outside the box, to apply design thinking methodologies. But then we also need the mechanisms by which to extract the value from that initiative, from all of those ideas. Which leads us to a much more modern definition of what innovation is and should be. And as you noticed, I've replaced the lollipop with basically the power button. And the reason for that is because I think the time of thinking about innovation as this nice to have for a lot of organizations, for a lot of industries, is going to come to an end. And it's going to become much more existential. So yes, it is about thinking about continuously transforming ideas, right? And it is about value creation, but it is also more specifically about proactively mitigating and managing risk in an increasingly dynamic and unpredictable world. And this is the key. It is about risk management. It is the only methodology that we can think of that actually addresses this. So if you think about innovation as a risk management tool, we can start to think about things like, what does that mean? Well, the first one is future proofing. So the ability for our organization to anticipate shifts in the market, whether it's customer driven, whether it's regulatory, whether it's technological, and really having a mechanism by which we can respond to it. And I've oftentimes used this analogy of people that go to the gym, right? So people that go to the gym, it's not because they're trying to prevent a heart attack tomorrow. They're preparing themselves to have a healthy frame of mind and a healthy being, such that in the face of some future predicament, they're going to have the wherewithal and the capabilities to respond to it. So future proofing, it can't be done at the point of attack. It has to be done before that. But then there's also beneficial things that we can think about as well, which is growth and diversification. And diversification, I think, is an important one that a lot of people often miss as well, which is how do we think about not just expanding our revenue streams, but getting into entirely new revenue models and revenue methodologies or revenue streams from new products that reduce our dependency on our core, that continue to evolve, right? And the more that we can grow and diversify, right, the less dependent we are going to be on one particular thing taking us out. And lastly, we should be thinking about agility and resilience, right? Our ability as an organization to iterate, to pivot, to respond to chaotic environments, to respond to what our competition is doing, because they're going to be listening to conversations like this as well. And our ability to respond to that is largely going to be driven by how well we can manage our innovation frameworks. Now, I'm going to talk to you about a couple of things that I've heard in the past that people are trying to do when we get into implementation. But the first thing I want to focus on here, though, is how do we reposition and redefine innovation from a lollipop that you kind of hand out to some people as a gift or as a response or just to say that we have an amazing environment to something that actually starts to become much more mission critical. And this is the first thing that we have to do in context of thinking about innovation. Now, when I say traditional, I don't want you to think I'm talking about, 100 years ago. Traditional includes the stuff, as I mentioned to you, that Paul and I were talking about just even a couple of years ago. And traditional is about R&D driven, product focused, efficiency oriented, and all those things, right? Adjacent, sustaining, disruptive, and all that is great. It doesn't mean any of those things were wrong. It just means that we also have to think about a new context on top of those as well. So our frameworks need to evolve, just like our science is evolving, just like our markets are evolving, our understanding of health is evolving. We have to also evolve our understanding of what innovation means and how to apply it correctly. So markets move far too fast for traditional disruption cycles, right? And I think the pace with which things are moving, people don't appreciate. And I'm going to show you some graphics later on to hopefully put that in context as well. And Paul mentioned Tesla. Totally agree, right? Massively disruptive company in the auto industry, but evolving much faster than we would have been able to predict using traditional models. The second is that we should not think about innovation as being sort of a linear function, but it's more and more and more today ecosystem driven. Traditional models assume companies are kind of doing everything alone, right? But today, ecosystems are really the things that are the platforms of success. And if we think about this ecosystem play, we have to think about how do we as an organization interface with our ecosystem in a collaborative way that allows it to be a win-win situation. Nothing really exemplifies this better than thinking about open source software, right? Which is fundamentally an ecosystem-driven construct. And finally, we've got to address the elephant in the room. It's AI, right? And yes, of course, AI has been around for 60, 70 years. And of course, it's been evolving all those times. But we have to really think about this moment around ChatGPT and LLMs and what they've been able to do, which is to make intelligence and our ability to manipulate and interface data and understanding and knowledge in a fundamentally different way. It has now made it accessible. And that accessibility of AI is really the frontier that we have just started to explore. And so as a result, we need to make that embedded into our innovation strategy. And so AI-driven solutions, right, are really just blurring this boundary between the adjacent, the incremental, and the disruptive and transformative. And all of this means that we need to have a new frame for what we think about innovation. And everything that we're doing at Innovera and also with the establishment of the Luminarian Fellowship is really around pushing the frontiers of this new definition. We fundamentally believe that innovation is a discipline. It's not a nice to have. It's not something that should just be treated as like, oh, you know what, that's the fun, crazy people and the whiteboards and the Post-it notes, and that's about it. It should be viewed as being something that has the same level of urgency across the organization as marketing does, right? Or as sales does, or as engineering does. But it shouldn't be viewed as being sort of a thin smear like a butter on toast kind of construct that we're going to push everywhere. You can't make a discipline that way. You can't manage budgets that way. You can't plan that way. You have to think about it as a holistic core function that needs to be treated as a discipline. And again, I love analogies, and the analogy that I always use is I think innovation today is where marketing was about 40 years ago. And so as marketing has now evolved into more or less a science, right? But absolutely a discipline. We need to push innovation into that as well, right? Because the urgency of figuring this out, I think, is going to be more and more profound across organizations as we continue this rapid evolution of technologies and of markets around us. So that is the preamble to say, why is innovation important and how should we be thinking about it? And largely around the fact that whatever you thought worked or didn't work in the past, that's a previous definition of innovation that we should cast aside. We are going to shed our skin and move forward with basically a new construct, a new definition of innovation. And so what do we want to think about in this, which is get rid of these definitions and these frameworks that have been sort of potentially holding you back and redefine those, right? Don't get rid of them necessarily, but redefine those in terms of continuous and adaptive frameworks and ecosystem-driven approaches. And this is how we should be thinking about a modern view of how to manage innovation. So this is exactly what we want to dive into in the rest of our conversation. So I've got 3 topics that I'd like to share with you. Of the 1,000 that we can talk about, these are sort of a couple that popped up. And these were largely driven by questions that I was asked by friends and executives across different organizations. And so I'm just going to give you a tiny snapshot of at least my perspective into each of these things. The first is people love this idea of transforming the culture of an organization. And unfortunately, transforming the culture of an organization is non-trivial, right? It's not the thing that you can actually address. You've got to address a whole ecosystem of things around that before the culture starts to get impacted. And we think that we have an idea of what this should look like. So let's begin there for a second. To do this, I think we need to establish, again, urgency. And then to establish urgency today, I'm going to take you back like 1,000 years. And in most of my talks that I give, I've repurposed and reused this graphic over and over again for the past, I want to say, 5-6 years, because I think it actually starts to capture the essence of what we're talking about pretty well. So let's think about the evolution of technology over a span of 1,000 years. And we can think about that in terms of its impact on economic output and efficiency. So what I'm displaying for you here is GDP per capita in England, which was a very well-studied market going back almost 1,000 years. So what they did was they looked across this and they said, well, look, for a long time, the economy scaled as the population grew, right? So you can see a little bit of a blip and a slight slope to this line because of that. So you say, great, that makes a lot of sense. Now, we all know, because we have the benefit of books and history and what have you, that this line changed. But I think the dramatic way with which it changed is something slightly unexpected. And what caused this change was largely driven by what are defined as being our technology disruptions, our industrial revolutions, right? The first, the second, the third. And now arguably now we're sitting in the middle of the fourth. There's a few things I want to show you here, right, that I think are important. One is that this is not the first time that we're dealing with any of this stuff, right? And we've been dealing with this, again, for, several centuries. And every time we introduce foundational technology shifts, right, we introduce efficiency. So you can see the slope of this curve is in terms of the output, slightly shifts in the first one, shifts in even more in the second one, shifts even more in the third one. Now, the scary part is it's almost vertical now, right? And we cannot assume that, okay, well, it's going to stop shifting and it's going to flatline and it's going to do that. No, like in the past 1,000 years, that hasn't happened. And so we shouldn't assume that all of a sudden it's going to happen for whatever reason. We go into a technological ice age and the world freezes. That's not the case. And so as a result of that, we have to think about, okay, well, with this new type of technology, what are the things that we're going to be able to do in terms of efficiency and output that we can generate by applying this technology. The other thing I'd like to point out here, though, is that the slope of this is dictated by the change in output over a span of time. The steeper the slope, the shorter the amount of time that we're talking about for that same amount of output. And so the reason I'm saying that technology and innovation-driven outcomes are going to have to become much more urgent today than they were even 10 years ago is because we have far less time to respond to it than we did before. And so our ability to apply things from 20 years ago and assume that they're going to be applicable today are not necessarily useful constructs. We have to redefine a lot of things, but also we have to understand that the world is changing faster than ever before. And again, to do that, we don't have to go back a long, long time. Let me just take you back 10 years. 10 years ago, these were according to Wikipedia, the highest valued companies by market cap, right? So the usual suspects, right? Companies that you would say, okay, well, these are definitely the highest valued companies because they have a lot of history, a lot of stuff, a lot of assets, a lot of legacy. They've been around for a while. As of Q4 of last year, these are the highest valued companies in order. And when I ask people this, I'm like, well, what do you see? How do you think about the commonalities across these? They often say, well, they're technology companies, or they're digital, or that they're consumer oriented. And all those things are true, right? All those things are true. But apart from Berkshire Hathaway, which is an amazing, anomaly in and of itself, the other thing is that these companies were born in a different model. These companies were born innovative, and they were born through the venture capital model. And this venture paradigm is the advantage that we have sitting here in Silicon Valley. So those same logos are more or less scattered across here. You can kind of see all these different companies from the likes of the Teslas and the Apples and what have you across Silicon Valley. And Silicon Valley is a very, very amazing place. It's the epicenter of technology investing in terms of, the epicenter of venture capital, if you will. It has a very, very powerful and strong ecosystem of founders and investors and operators. But the one thing that people think about, I think largely incorrectly, is that they think about this as being sort of a entrepreneurial driven ecosystem, which is true, but it's actually an ecosystem driven by the venture paradigm. It's the understanding and the shared understanding of risk taking, of risk management, of capital allocation, and of milestone-based execution. So from the investors to the operators, this language of how you evolve and how you develop a crazy idea into a world-changing company is sort of mutually understood and mutually appreciated. And I'm just showing you a few of the ones that we showed, but obviously, like, there are hundreds and thousands, and I can litter this with so many logos you wouldn't even be able to figure out what we're actually looking at. This map is pretty profound. But the advantage that we have here, though, is, again, the fact that we're sitting here in Silicon Valley and we're living and breathing the venture paradigm. And so when it comes to thinking about what makes this an innovative ecosystem and innovative culture, we've looked across at Stanford with some research that we're doing on innovation historically, decades of literature on innovation and innovation cultures and sort of outcomes and outputs. And all of that, literally hundreds and hundreds of papers and white papers and books and research studies and everything else, fall down into these things, right? So mindset, execution, leadership, organizational culture and structure, and strategy. These are the 5 drivers of thinking about innovation and innovative culture in general. And all of these can actually be implemented by understanding the venture paradigm and how to transfer and transport that venture paradigm, which is basically backbone of Silicon Valley, into organizations. Because these in isolation and in independence are incredibly difficult to address. by themselves. So why is a culture so hard to shift? Because you've got to shift these underpinning things, and these underpinning things in and of themselves are extremely difficult if you don't have a framework that you're mimicking and you're copying from. The advantage that we have, again, is that we're basically saying, can we extract the goodness and the interesting bits and parts of the foundations of the venture paradigm from Silicon Valley, and then transfer it and transport it into an organizational structure that makes sense. So that's the first one when we think about sort of culture of innovation. The second thing that we want to start to think about is, well, great, we understand culture is hard and we may have a framework to apply to that, which is wonderful. How do we start to think about structures that align with the delivery of this value? And this is another piece of work that we've been doing at Stanford, which is to really think about the context of innovation. And I see organizations make this mistake like systematically all the time. First thing that they do is that they are lacking an understanding that the source of innovative initiatives is everywhere. Remember, we said ecosystem oriented. That's exactly true here. There's a profound amount of internal ideas that are great and interesting, and an equal amount, if not more, outside the organization. And then a whole bunch of things that we can start to think about co-developing together with the outside ecosystem. So our source of innovation and the way that we manage it has to span internal and external. A lot of concepts and ideas in terms of ecosystems of innovation have addressed this, including foundational work around open innovation by Henry Chesborough, which is fantastic, right? Where I think the bigger issue is people don't really understand how to think about the level of maturity of their initiatives. And I'm not talking about the magnitude of the initiative, like whether it's like an incremental thing or a massively disruptive thing. I'm talking about how mature is this thing from a product adoption and delivery perspective, and from a customer feedback and customer adoption perspective. And so if we apply that thinking, we can start to think about the innovation stage as being across three different Ds, right? So discover, develop, and deliver. So how do we think about, where these new ideas could be? How do we actually implement and test and validate those in a very defined way? And then how do we shift that validation from a development phase into a value delivery phase that can become scalable and commercialized over time? And innovation basically lives across these three different stages. So as a good engineer, we kind of stick these together, and we realize that we have two independent axes, and we can actually start to organize the way that our structure should be thought of inside of an organization, right? So the first thing that we want to start to think about is that discovery across the different sources. We've got R&D on one side, and we've got relationships externally around hackathons and university, partnerships and what have you on the outside. And these things form a continuum. From there, we go into development, whether it's a skunkworks-like program, an internal innovation development function, all the way to we are only dealing with development stage companies and startups on the outside through our CVC function. I'll talk about the studio in a second. And lastly, we think about innovation delivery. So internal product line innovation, how do we actually take these solutions and implement them either as standalone products or part of our existing solutions? How do we think about partnerships? And then how do we think about M&A? How do we internalize and own the stuff that's on the outside? And you'll notice here that I've added a D here, right? And I genuinely believe that this is going to be an entire new category over the next 10, 20 years, which is going to be divestitures. I think just as much interest as there is in terms of mergers, acquisitions to bring stuff inside, we should also be thinking about things that do not belong inside as being value drivers that can actually finance the stuff that we should be focusing on the inside as well. And we put all these things together and we end up with our 3D innovation management matrix. So let me address this in context specifically. The studio here, we define it as being an orchestration engine for all the initiatives and all the outcomes. But what we strongly believe is that these independent functions, if siloed, do not have a chance of delivering corporate scale value, which is the ultimate goal of this function. So how do we break down the silos? How do we actually unify the concepts? And how, more importantly, do we ensure that we don't have the wrong expectations of a given unit to deliver the value that it's beyond its scope, right? So how do we make sure that the R&D team is not responsible for delivering revenues? It just doesn't make sense. That's not their goal. Their goal is to discover the stuff that we should be doing and then pass that on to a different set of skills that can actually pilot, implement, and then pass those on into commercialization teams. And so this movement and this orchestration is the first thing that we need to think about in terms of being more agile and more responsive. And the thing that I think you're probably going to notice and appreciate is that I have isolated this conversation completely from the core of the business. And some of this thinking I credit to some work that was done by Jeffrey Moore in his book called Zone to Win, which I love, which really started to create a very definitive barrier and boundary between these two dual zone models of how to think about innovation, the core zone and the innovation zone. So the core of the business should continue as is because there's too much complexity trying to take all of these decision cycles and these decision rubrics that we're talking about in terms of modern innovation and blast those inside of the core. The responsiveness, the ability to manage budgets, the ability to manage KPIs, and the ability to actually manage what the objectives are is going to be too different and too skewed if we try to merge these two things as one. So for the time being, we kind of view those as being two different functions, except that they are 100% aligned. That alignment is what we mean by the fact that they should not be like a brick wall, like a concrete barrier between these two zones. It should be a permeable membrane, but it should be a discipline. On one side, we have the discipline of innovation. The other side, we have the discipline of execution. And we treat each of those with respect. And we have the budget management and everything else on this side. So from a structure perspective, this is what we strongly believe is that we need to think about taking the existing functions that are responsible for innovation, aligning them, orchestrating them, treating them with sort of a different level of respect, but also sheltering them from decision cycles and decision models of the existing core. So moving forward to our final topic is how do we think about a framework for managing all of this? And I'm going to bring this back full circle to thinking about a framework for how venture capital actually works. And unfortunately, the thing that I often see when we enter a new conversation with an organization and they say, well, look, these are all the different things that we're doing for innovation, and these are all the crazy new ideas that we're working on, and these are all the new different billion-dollar businesses we're going to go launch. I say, great, wonderful. That's all good. I unfortunately think about them as just being sandcastles because the foundation for execution and the foundation for what's going to actually make these ideas tangible and scalable and executable is largely missing. And those are the things that we can observe from an outside perspective. So we see a lot of people putting a lot of bets and a lot of promise and a lot of hope on things that really will not stand the test of time and don't have a backbone for scalable execution. So let's go back. New definition of modern innovation. What are we trying to do? Grow and diversify, future-proof the current business, and then create a transformation inside of our organization in terms of our ability to be agile and resilient. So if we say that that's what we want to do, that basically means that we have our foundational pieces. We understand the purpose. That should be the purpose. But innovation is about people. And I think this is oftentimes the thing that's understood, but not really understood, right? The venture ecosystem, entrepreneurship, everything else that we're talking about here is largely driven by people that have the ability to put one foot in front of the other and make things happen. So the combination of these two things is what we need as a starting point. So we need to understand why we're doing this, and then we need to then empower and have the right people in place to be able to execute. So is that good enough? And the answer is fundamentally no, right? Because that's like having a very energized, caffeinated meeting with a whole bunch of people around the table. Doesn't really lead you to the outcome that you're thinking of. So how do we think about purpose and people in context of actually creating an operating framework? So sandwiched in between these are the rest of our frameworks, right? And so we call these our 6P frameworks. So we begin with the right people. Those people ideally are working on amazing projects, right? These are strategic ventures. These are initiatives. These are things that are within the context of what we would define as being innovative. But it's within a portfolio. And this portfolio style thinking is largely missing. The venture paradigm is anchored around portfolio theory. I want to just repeat that for a second, right? Because I think it's largely what's missing in terms of people's understandings. They get it, but they don't really think about it this way, right? It's not about risk taking. It's about portfolio management, right? You place 10 bets and you hope that one, maybe two, are going to do something really, really profound and interesting. And if they do, you are a phenomenal venture capitalist. Portfolio. This moonshot approach without a portfolio model behind it is extremely challenging. So we say, great, now that we understand that, we got this balanced portfolio. Well, how do we build that portfolio? Well, you build it because you've got the right processes. So you got your strategies that are aligned. You've got the resource allocation methodologies in place. And you've got portfolio management theory that you've now been introduced to. And you have the environment that's set up, as I mentioned to you, this dual zone model that allows you to achieve what it is that you want to achieve. And this is the backbone and the foundation of our 6P model. So what is it? It's you build the foundation. So you know what you're trying to do. You have established the structure. You've established the processes and the methodologies by which you want to govern this thing. And then you implement a very strong, aligned portfolio management structure that allows you to invest and continue to double down on the things that are aligned, that are transformative, and that are working, and allows you to very transparently and openly pull resources from the things that aren't, such that you can actually then manage this without you requiring an infinite budget. If every idea in Silicon Valley just from day one received $1 billion, this entire ecosystem would collapse, right? Most ideas begin with just a little bit of money. If they execute, they get a little bit more. If they execute, they get a little bit more. And if you are one of the lucky few that has actually demonstrated the fact that you've got market and technology traction, then you get a whole lot more. And this is exactly how venture works. So to sum it all up, as you've sort of hopefully realized this, is that we're not really trying to innovation wash anything. In fact, all we're really trying to do here is to help promote innovation as a structured discipline that is necessary and is going to be a foundational part of organizations and businesses over the next decade, 2 decades, and potentially for all businesses going forward. This has to do with your understanding and your appreciation of the fact that the slope of that curve is almost vertical right now. So if we were to zoom in on this thing, right, it would be almost to the point of creating mass urgency on a daily basis. And what we want to do is provide the methodologies and the mechanics to transform ideas into actions. So we want to transform this idea of innovation into a discipline. And along with that journey, what we hope is that you and your leadership and your organizations join us on this journey, because we think it's imperative and we hope that we can help you make it happen. So on that note, I will turn it back over to Paul, and perhaps we can field any questions or provocations or anything else that has been popped up. So I'll stop sharing here, Paul.
Pedram, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. a couple of reflections that I wanted to share with this audience. As I'd ask also if you could please post your questions in the chat. Pedram and I, in a couple of minutes, will be sort of addressing those. So as you're thinking about the presentation, a couple of things that I want to emphasize. One is innovation is no longer just the domain of the sort of Edisons, the Bill Gates, the Steve Jobs. Innovation can be taught. Innovation, as we think about a discipline, one of the things that we're doing at the Luminarian Fellowship is trying to engage those leaders responsible at the fulcrum of innovation and corporate activity. How might we be able to help those? And so if you'll allow me, I'll just share a few sort of concepts around the Luminarian Fellowship, and then we'll jump into questions. You can see my screen now. The Luminarian Fellowship is designed to target that person who's responsible for strategy, growth, and innovation. It's not just an executive education program, although we'll have dimensions to that. It's not just about professional growth, although we're certainly going to do that. It's really creating a community focused on these three key items: an invitation-only program that will span the entire globe. We think that there's lots of interesting things happening around the planet, and part of this is to bring people there, both who are in those ecosystems, but as well who are reflecting and thinking about it. So creating wonderful experiences across the globe. You'll see the dates and times. Those are all committed. We're trying to build a community. Oftentimes what we found with innovation leaders is that it's very difficult to have a phone call with your boss that a bunch of things have failed in the portfolio. The portfolio concept in many corporations is not as robust as it could be. Again, another learning opportunity. And so we're trying to build a community that where there's a difficult conversation or some advice and guidance, we'll have that ability to make the calls inside this organization, this sort of invite-only exclusive experience. With the shared knowledge that you'll be getting with our academic partner, Stanford, who's supporting Dimensions, both in the first session in Silicon Valley, as well as the lectures throughout the program. And then finally, you just have to show up to this program in each of these venues, and we'll take care of the rest, creating memorable experiences that you'll take away with a lifetime. And it is indeed a lifetime experience. So that's just a little bit about the Luminarian Fellowship. The reason that I'm so excited about being a part of Innovera is not only this program, which I co-direct with Zamir Shuko, who's on the call as well, but also because Innovera is focused on education, providing education, advisory, and consulting to make these projects not just creating that mindset change, but also providing the skill sets necessary for organizations to march forward and execute effectively, as well as the coaching and advisory to make that happen. Really at all levels, this is such an exciting opportunity. Now, with that said, I would love to have and think through some questions. I know, Pedram, you've been sort of taking a peek at those in the chat. Thank you, by the way. My commitment to you is we're going to wrap in 8 minutes. We may not get to all of the questions here, but I would love to I'm going to kick off just one. Pedram, you and I have talked a lot about innovation and some of the points of resistance. Core activity in a large corporation has got to be the driver. And yet you might have success in an innovation idea that needs to get incorporated into core. What have you seen? What challenges has that posed for large organizations as they think about ingesting a new and cool idea? What happens and what lessons can you share around that topic? I'll toss that over to you, and then we'll get to a couple others.
For sure. And as Paul mentioned, like we're trying to jam a bunch of 10-hour-long conversations and discussions in a few minutes. So I'll just share with you a couple of things that I've seen, Paul. So one of the biggest challenges is that it's a little bit like starting a fire. If anybody's ever been camping before and actually try, I'm terrible at making fires, but this is actually a pretty apt analogy. And you kind of get it going, and it's a little bit smoldering, and it's got a little bit of smoke, and it's like, okay, it's there may be fire here, right? It might just be enough, like, for a match. And then you throw 6 logs on top of it, right? But the first thing that happens is it dies, right? And you're like, oh, well, we had a fire, so why didn't that little tiny flame actually ignite all these logs? Well, you killed it, you suffocated it. That is honestly what happens in many, many cases that I've seen, where you have some idea independent of where it was born, but it doesn't actually get the resources it requires to take shape, right? And so at the idea stage is where it tries to get embedded inside of the organization. And that is where these big, heavy logs end up smoldering out what the initial ignition of the idea was. It's premature ingestion, maybe a term I'm making up on the fly here, right? It's premature ingestion of the idea, right? Where it hasn't had the maturity cycle of being validated, being developed, being hardened, and being set up in a construct whereby it can actually be a value driver in a demonstrable way that can then get ingested into the rest of the organization. And so it's the excitement of what it could be and the over enthusiasm of what it can be in the future, right? Where we're just like, we have smoke, let's knock down the tree and throw it on top of this thing because we're going to have a big bonfire, right? Inevitably, it's going to kill it. So, of the many, many things that I've seen, as being barriers, this is probably the most common and profound one.
Great. So Omar asked a really good question. Is it possible that the rapid pace of AI advancements and the sheer volume of innovations being generated are causing organizations to overlook truly transformative ideas, thereby creating a paradox?
Yes,
Really. So, yeah, talk a little bit about
100%.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. So look, this is the juxtaposition of our ability to think about the entire organization needs to be innovative, and we need to think about innovation as a discipline. The balance of these two things is incredibly important. You don't want to prevent your people from using new AI tools and thinking outside the box to make themselves more efficient, right? And so that's not what we're saying. Absolutely, we need to have 1,000 ideas on all parts of the organization and people thinking more aggressively going forward. In doing so, though, you need a mechanism by which you can filter through the ideas that are truly scalable versus the ideas that are saving you 5 minutes a day of doing some nonsense, right? It's like a lot of these AI tools can actually be viewed as, aging myself and many of you, right? Like Excel macros, right? You have an Excel macro, it does something cool for you, right? Is that like a big ass business? No, it's an Excel macro, right? But without it, you'd be spending 10, 15, 20 minutes a day doing some redundant nonsense. So everybody should have access to this new layer of technology. In doing so, though, we need to create mechanisms by which we can filter through the ones that are actually commercializable in a scalable way, in a different way. And what we're building towards at Innovera, sort of a selfish plug on that one, is a mechanism by which we can actually allow organizations to think through those. If there's a business case that allows one seed of an idea to be transferred into maybe an entire different product unit, there are very specific filters that you would apply for that, right? An Excel macro is very different from a commercializable AI product. And we can agree on what those definitions are. I mean, it's not crazy. So everybody should be thinking creatively. Everybody should be coming up with their macros. Everybody should be coming up with whatever ideas they have. But we should have a mechanism by which then we have a filtration process that allows the things that can be scaled, that have a path towards scaling, to then be put on a slightly different rail. And that's what we're missing in sort of the chaos of the modern organization. So Omar, your observations are spot on in terms of what's happening today. And it's just that we don't have a pressure release valve to extract the few things that are truly scalable out of all of the stuff that's actually happening. And we hope to be sort of on the frontiers of creating that.
So thank you, everybody who's posted questions. Probably could go on, as Pedram said, for at least 10 hours. But I just want to end with this last one from Sumit. So he says, so how do you set and manage outcome-based innovation roadmaps across geos and across cultures? You mentioned culture a little bit, Pedram, and then sort of what do you do to manage that, and sort of how do you sort of close loop the thing rather with where boundaries may be less clear and again culture, timing, and so on.
Totally. I think, in all honesty, I would have waxed theoretical 5, 6 years ago because this is such an incredibly difficult thing to manage. I think the way that we're doing it today is going to be different than what we did 5 years ago. And the way that we should be thinking about it today is the fact that everybody needs to be tapped into the same knowledge base across the organization, right? So much like I kind of showed you the matrix and I said, well, these are different, subfields. Those people could be co-located. Those people could actually be in the same office. The problem of co-location, right, is not the issue, is the fact that they're siloed in terms of their objectives and their functions because they're not tapped into a centralized knowledge core. And so as we start to think about the modern organization, we need to start to think about, is there an innovation graph that represents the shared knowledge of the company, independent of time zones and geographies and functions? And as long as we can tap into that, such that each piece of the organization is using its piece of it to understand that, but then we have a macro view of what all is going on, that's how we start to break down the silos, right? It's the transparency of knowledge sharing is really what we're excited about. And the reason I say we couldn't have done that 5 years ago is because largely a lot of that knowledge is captured in words. And we didn't have the ability to understand words inside of documents or files 2 or 3 years ago, right? We didn't have the ability to tap into every single meeting and extract a summary of those meetings. Now that we can now actually start to index those ideas and those thoughts. And so we're at the cusp of an entirely new frontier of our ability to manage the knowledge that actually fuels innovation. And that is really, really interesting.
So, Pedram, I think we'll have to leave it there. As an educator, a former associate vice provost at Stanford, who was in charge of extended education, I love the idea that maybe education can start to help, a common knowledge base can start to help connect cultures and organizations. If everybody's thinking along the same mindset and is equipped with the right skill sets, we have half a chance to create a discipline around innovation. With that, I want to thank you. Have a good day, and wherever you are, please tune in for our next Luminarian Fellowship webinar. We hope to bring you more inspiring speakers and thoughts around this exciting space as we move from innovation as art to a discipline. Thank you so much, and have a good day.